Why are your photos blurry? Well, there's a couple of reasons they could be. Let's start out with handheld photos. We'll talk about reasons your photos might be blurry if they're on a tripod in a moment. Odds are if it's a moving subject, that's called motion blur. That's probably because your shutter speed is too low. Your phone, your average camera in auto mode will pick the lower shutter speed to keep the ISO low. The camera will pick the aperture it thinks is appropriate to keep the ISO low, so you get nice image quality. However, it usually assumes the subject isn't moving. But first things first, I have to explain what aperture is, shutter speed, and ISO, and why if they're set wrong, you're going to get blurry photos. Without further ado, let's get into talking about those. Let's start by explaining aperture. Aperture's weird. Let's take a look at this lens here so I can show you the weirdness. You might recognize this lens from my first video on the channel. Now, what is weird is f16, even though it's the biggest number on the lens, is the smallest aperture opening. f1.4 is the largest. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's the way it is. Bigger the number, the smaller the hole in the lens is, and the less light it's gathering. As you can see, that's f16. Let me illustrate with these cups. Your aperture is like these cups here. The light is like water. So, smaller f number, larger container of water. The smaller the aperture number is, more light you can gather. It's like having a bigger cup. So, to repeat, small aperture number, lots of light gathering capacity. Which again, smaller f number, much more light gathering capacity. Large f number, less light gathering capacity, like you can see in this little cup here. Your shutter speed is like the flow of water, how fast the water is flowing into your container. The slower the shutter speed, the slower the light will flow, like water in a faucet, as you can see here. Slow shutter speed, taking a long time for the water to flow into the cup. Fast shutter speed, not taking as much time for water to flow into the cup. That's how your aperture and shutter speed work in tandem to get you sharp photos. Let's take a look at some example shutter speeds. This is 1/1000th of a second. Here's a 20th second exposure. So, to further elaborate, if you have a slow shutter speed like you saw there, what's happening is the camera doesn't have enough time to capture the motion in a still frame, as the shutter was set too slow. Not enough time. So, you need to select a faster shutter speed. It's a moving person slowly moving around, usually about like 1/2000th of a second should be fine. Sometime 1/60th of a second is fine. Sometimes you need super fast shutter speeds, like 1/1000th of a second. It's going to depend on what you're photographing. The other reason your photos could be blurry is atmospheric distortion, as you can see in this example. There really isn't much what can be done about this, but for perhaps stopping the lens down or coming back on a different day. The other thing that can be causing your photos to be blurry is camera shake. This is particularly pronounced with telephoto lenses, but it can happen with any lens that's heavy. Is your shutter speed is too slow to compensate for the fact that your hands are shaking and your body is moving. The other thing you can do to compensate would be to lean on something, put the camera on the ground or a table, or break out a tripod or a monopod. Your ISO is the camera's sensitivity to light. So if you can't open the aperture any wider, and you can't make the shutter speed any slower because the photos are coming out blurry, you have no choice but to increase the ISO. The ISO is how sensitive your camera is to light, or if you're using film, how sensitive the film is to light. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. A low ISO like 100, not super sensitive to light. As you go up in ISO to 200, 400, 800, 16,000, 30,000, etc., you can notice a degradation in image quality. Us photographers call noise. Kind of like blocky, circly kind of pattern in the image. I'll show you some example photos with high noise. Certain cameras do better at it than others. Most phones and cameras with smaller sensors like phones tend not to do very good in low light. Now, what you do with those is you add more light, either a flash or a video light or something, or, open a blind or drape to let more light in. These things in combination, used together, will help you get sharp photos. Now, finally moving on to why your photos could be blurry if you're on a tripod. Well, for starters, the wind, for example, can buffet the camera around. There are two good ways to compensate for this. Number one, your tripod should have a hook on the bottom, which you can use to put a weight on, like your backpack or a purpose-built photography weight. Or you can put your body as well between the camera and the wind to help. The other thing that could be going on is if you're photographing like on a dock or a walkway or something that's not solid ground, the vibrations from the people walking around could be causing blur as well. If you're using a very, very long shutter speed and you're noticing the stars are blurry, like a shutter speed which is about like a minute or two, what's actually going on is your camera is being affected by the Earth's rotation. In that case, you need to use a faster shutter speed and a faster ISO. Let's talk about a fun effect you can get with motion blur. As you saw in previous photos, if you have moving objects in a photo, but the buildings and the landscape's not moving, you can get a cool effect like this. In conclusion, I hope this helps. And don't forget to like and subscribe. If you wish to support me, you can support me on PayPal, Redbubble, Society6, and Adobe Stock. You can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Behance.